The morning of November 21st, 1943, dawned with the kind of deceptive calm that masks catastrophe. Marine Corporal James "Red" Sullivan crouched inside his M4 Sherman tank, feeling the metal hull vibrate as the landing craft approached Betio Island in the Tarawa Atoll. Through the driver's periscope, he could see the palm-fringed beach ahead, smoke already rising from the preliminary bombardment. What he couldn't see, what none of them could see, was that the Japanese defenders had prepared a weapon that would expose a fatal flaw in American armor, a vulnerability so simple, yet so devastating, that it would force tank crews across the Pacific to become battlefield inventors, transforming their steel war machines with the most primitive material imaginable, wood. This is the story of how desperation bred innovation, how wooden planks bolted to tank hulls became the difference between life and death, and how American tankers learned that sometimes the simplest solutions prove more effective than the most sophisticated engineering. It's a story that begins with terror and ends with a profound irony that in the modern mechanized warfare of the Pacific, salvation came not from metallurgy or industrial might, but from lumber yards and carpentry. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Red Sullivan had joined the 2nd Marine Tank Battalion in early 1943, trained at Camp Pendleton in California on the brand new M4 Sherman medium tank. The Sherman was a marvel of American industrial design, 33 tons of welded steel, powered by a Continental radial engine that could push the 20-foot-long vehicle to 25 miles per hour. Its 75mm main gun could demolish fortifications, while a 50-caliber machine gun mounted on the turret provided anti-aircraft protection. The Sherman's armor ranged from 1 inch on the sides to 3 inches on the front glacis plate, thick enough to stop most small arms, fire and shrapnel. The Marines who trained on these machines developed an almost paternal affection for them. They were roomier than the Stuart light tanks the Corps had used earlier in the war, with space for a 5-man crew: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver who also manned the bow machine gun. Unlike the cramped, stifling Japanese tanks they would face, the Sherman had relatively good ventilation and visibility. It felt substantial, powerful, safe. But safe was a relative term in the Pacific, and the Marines were about to learn a harsh lesson about the limits of their armor. The battle plan for Tarawa called for the 2nd Marine Division to seize Betio, a tiny coral island barely 3 miles long and 800 yards wide at its widest point. Intelligence suggested the pre-invasion bombardment would pulverize Japanese defenses. The reality proved catastrophically different. When the first wave of Marines hit the beaches, they encountered a nightmare of interlocking fire from concrete bunkers and pillboxes that had weathered the bombardment almost intact. The landing craft grounded on the reef, far from shore, forcing Marines to wade hundreds of yards through chest-deep water while Japanese machine guns cut them down. The Sherman tanks of Company C, 2nd Tank Battalion, were supposed to provide crucial fire support, but getting them ashore proved nearly impossible. Several drowned when their landing craft foundered in deep water. Others became stuck on the reef or were hit by Japanese anti-tank guns before reaching the beach. Of the 14 Shermans committed to the assault, only 2 made it to shore operational on the first day. Red Sullivan's tank, christened Colorado after his home state, was one of the fortunate ones. His driver, a farm boy from Iowa named Tommy Hendricks, somehow navigated the treacherous approach, and they ground up onto the coral sand with water still pouring from the escape hatches. Through the vision blocks, Red could see Marines hugging the seawall, pinned down by fire from a massive concrete blockhouse. "Target, blockhouse, 1 o'clock, barked Lieutenant Morrison, their tank commander. The gunner, a quiet Pennsylvanian named Eddie Kowalski, traversed the turret and sent a 75mm high-explosive round screaming toward the fortification. The explosion blew away chunks of concrete but didn't penetrate the thick walls. For the next hour, Colorado provided mobile fire support, crushing barbed wire obstacles, destroying machine gun nests, and allowing infantry to advance. The Sherman proved its worth repeatedly that day. its armor shrugging off small arms fire that would have killed exposed infantrymen. But as the sun climbed higher and the temperature inside the tank soared past 120 degrees, the Marines encountered something new. A Japanese soldier emerged from a camouflaged foxhole just yards from Colorado, moving with startling speed. He wore no uniform, only a loincloth, and he carried what looked like a rectangular package wrapped in cloth. Before anyone could react, he threw himself against the side of the tank, slapping the package onto the hull just above the track. The magnetic mine detonated with a sharp crack that rang through the tank like a bell. The explosion was smaller than Red expected, but the effect was devastating. The shaped charge bored through the 1-inch side armor as if it were paper, sending a jet of superheated metal into the crew compartment. Tommy Hendricks screamed as molten fragments tore into his leg. The tank's electrical system sparked and died. Acrid smoke filled the interior. "Bail out! Bail out!" Lieutenant Morrison was already throwing open the turret hatch. The crew scrambled out, dragging Tommy with them, and took cover in a nearby shell crater while Colorado burned, ammunition cooking off in sporadic explosions. They survived, but Colorado did not. And across Betio that day, the same scene repeated itself. Japanese defenders, realizing conventional anti-tank guns couldn't easily penetrate Sherman frontal armor, had trained in suicide attacks with magnetic mines. The Type 99 magnetic anti-tank mine weighed about 4 pounds and used a shaped charge warhead specifically designed to defeat armor through focused explosive energy rather than blast. The magnets allowed it to stick to any steel surface, and a fanatic soldier could place it exactly where American armor was weakest, the thinner side plates or the engine deck. By nightfall on November 21st, the Marines had secured only a narrow beachhead at tremendous cost. Of the few Shermans that made it ashore, several had been knocked out by magnetic mines or by soldiers who climbed onto the tanks and dropped grenades through the hatches. One tank was destroyed when a Japanese soldier stuffed a satchel charge, a canvas bag packed with explosives, into the engine grill, detonating the fuel tanks. The Americans had never faced such fanatically determined close-quarters anti-tank tactics. German soldiers in North Africa might try to approach a tank with a magnetic mine if circumstances permitted, but they didn't make it a standard tactic, and they certainly didn't do it with the suicidal determination the Japanese displayed. At Tarawa, American tankers learned that their armor, while proof against most Japanese weapons at range, became a death trap when enemy infantry got close. Red Sullivan spent that first night huddled in a foxhole, listening to the sounds of battle, feeling the loss of Colorado like a physical wound. His burned hands, minor injuries from grabbing hot metal during the bailout, throbbed with each heartbeat. Around him, other survivors from the tank battalion compared notes, shared stories of narrow escapes. The consensus was grim. If the Japanese could get close, they could kill a Sherman. The tank's greatest strength, their thick armor that protected against artillery and anti-tank guns, meant nothing against a determined man with a magnetic mine. The battle for Tarawa lasted 3 more days of savage fighting. The Marines ultimately prevailed through sheer firepower and determination, but at horrific cost. Over 1,000 Americans killed and more than 2,000 wounded, all to secure an island you could walk across in 30 minutes. For the tank crews who survived, the lessons were clear and sobering. The Sherman was a superb machine, but its design hadn't anticipated an enemy willing to die to destroy it. When Red Sullivan returned to Hawaii in December 1943, he was assigned to help train replacement crews for the losses at Tarawa. The 2nd Tank Battalion needed to be rebuilt, re-equipped, and prepared for the next operation. Intelligence reports indicated the Japanese were standardizing suicide anti-tank tactics across the Pacific. Every island fortress the Marines would assault would likely face the same threat. But something else was happening in Hawaii during those months of rebuilding. In maintenance depots and tank parks across the islands, American ingenuity was beginning to assert itself. Tank crews, maintenance officers, and marine engineers were studying the Tarawa losses and asking hard questions. How do you protect a tank against magnetic mines? How do you prevent enemy soldiers from climbing onto the hull? The official solution from the Ordnance Department involved complex engineering, stronger side armor, better hull designs, perhaps some kind of magnetic shielding. But redesigning and manufacturing new tanks would take years. The Marines needed a solution now, before the next operation. It was in this context that someone history doesn't record exactly who suggested something so simple it seemed almost absurd. Wooden planks. The logic, once explained, was elegant. Magnetic mines needed metal to stick to. If you created a wooden barrier over the tank's steel hull, the magnets wouldn't work. The mine would either fall off or be held far enough from the hull that the shaped charge jet would dissipate before reaching the armor. It was the same principle as spaced armor, which tankers had known about since the First World War. An outer layer that either defeats or disrupts the incoming threat before it reaches the primary armor. But would it work? In January 1944, Marine engineers at Pearl Harbor conducted tests. They welded U-shaped steel channels to the sides of a Sherman tank, creating a framework, then bolted 2-inch by 12-inch oak planks to the channels. The planks stood roughly 4 inches away from the hull, creating a dead space. They painted the wood with whatever was available, sometimes standard marine green, sometimes left bare. Then they tested it with captured point Japanese magnetic mines. The mines stuck to the wood planks but failed to maintain contact with the steel hull beneath. More importantly, when detonated, the shaped charges that would have easily penetrated 1-inch side armor now expended their energy against oak. The wooden planks often splintered or were blown off entirely, but the tank's actual armor remained intact. The dead space was just enough to dissipate the focused jet of the shaped charge before it could pierce steel. It worked. This laughably low-tech solution nailing lumber to a tank actually worked. Red Sullivan first saw the wooden armored Shermans in late January 1944, as the 2nd Marine Tank Battalion prepared for Operation Flintlock, the assault on Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands. The new tanks looked strange, almost primitive, like someone had tried to disguise a modern war machine as a barn. The oak planks added several inches to the tank's width, making it bulkier, less streamlined. Some crews worried it would affect performance, make the tank more likely to throw a track or bog down. But the alternative was facing magnetic mines with no protection at all. Colorado II, Red's new tank, named in honor of the one he'd lost at Tarawa, received its wooden armor on February 1st. The installation took less than a day. Marine engineers welded steel channels to the sponsons over the suspension and tracks, then bolted the planks in place, leaving gaps for hatches and the engine deck. The wood was treated with some kind of fire retardant, though everyone privately doubted it would help much if the tank took a direct hit. The crew inspected their modified tank with mixed feelings. It looked makeshift, jury-rigged, like something soldiers cobbled together out of desperation rather than something approved by the Ordnance Department, which, in a sense, it was. There had been no formal specification, no official manual, just marine tankers and engineers solving a problem, with the materials at hand. "Looks like my granddaddy's barn," commented Eddie Kowalski, the gunner. "Yeah, but your granddaddy's barn never had to stop a Japanese mine," replied Lieutenant Morrison. He'd been promoted after Tarawa and was now their platoon leader, commanding 3 tanks including Colorado II. Morrison was a practical man, uninterested in aesthetics. If wooden planks kept his men alive, he'd nail fence posts to the tanks if necessary. The assault on Kwajalein began on February 1st, 1944. Unlike Tarawa, this operation went relatively smoothly. The pre-invasion bombardment was far more thorough, the beaches were more suitable for armor, and the Japanese garrison was smaller. But they still attempted their suicide anti-tank tactics. On the 2nd day of fighting, Colorado II was supporting an infantry push against a series of bunkers when Red spotted movement in his peripheral vision. A Japanese soldier darted from behind a destroyed bunker, carrying a magnetic mine, sprinting toward the tank's side. "Enemy on our left!" Red shouted, traversing the turret machine gun. But he was too slow. The soldier slammed the mine against the wooden planks and ducked away, expecting the tank to die. The mine detonated with a sharp crack. Inside Colorado II, the crew felt the impact, heard the explosion, but nothing penetrated. When the smoke cleared, the wooden planks on the left side had been blown away, the steel framework bent, but the tank's actual hull was unmarked. The shaped charge had expended its force against wood and air. "We're hit, but we're good," Tommy Hendricks called from the driver's seat. His leg had healed enough for him to return to duty, though he walked with a permanent limp now. They kept fighting. An hour later, another magnetic mine struck the front, with the same result: destroyed wooden armor, intact steel hull. By the end of the day, Colorado II looked battered, several of its wooden planks blown off or hanging by single bolts, but the tank remained fully operational. Without that wooden armor, Red Sullivan would have been blown out of 2 tanks in 2 operations. Word spread quickly through the tank battalions. The wooden armor worked. It actually worked. What had seemed like a desperate improvisation was proving itself in combat. As February turned to March and the Marines prepared for subsequent operations in the Marshall Islands, the wooden armor modifications became standard. More tanks received the treatment. Engineers refined the design, learning optimal plank spacing and mounting methods. They discovered that leaving small gaps between planks actually helped it prevented an entire wall of wood from being blown off by a single mine, localizing the damage. But the wooden armor solved only half the problem. The magnetic mines were defeated, but Japanese soldiers were still trying to climb onto the tanks, prying open hatches and dropping grenades inside. They targeted vision blocks, trying to blind the crew. They stuffed explosives into the engine grills. The suicide attacks continued, and tankers needed more protection. The solution to this problem came from multiple sources simultaneously, as often happens with military innovation. History fails to record exactly who began welding nails to the tank hatches, points facing upward. The idea was simple and brutal: make the tank impossible to climb on. Japanese soldiers trying to wrench open a hatch would instead impale their hands on 3-inch nails. Other crews went further, welding iron rods or metal spikes to every flat surface on the tank, the engine deck, the turret roof, the hull. One Marine tank on Roy Namur was photographed with so many spikes protruding from it that it looked like a mechanical porcupine. The tankers called these modifications anti-personnel devices, though they were more accurately anti-boarding measures. Still, others installed wire mesh cages over the hatches, creating standoff barriers that would catch thrown grenades and allow them to detonate harmlessly away from the tank's interior. Some crews improvised these cages from Japanese bed frames or salvaged construction materials. The engineering was crude but effective. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By March 1944, Sherman tanks in the Pacific were looking increasingly unlike the factory-standard machines that had rolled off Detroit assembly lines. They bristled with wooden armor, metal spikes, wire cages, and various other field modifications. Some carried logs chained to the hull, originally intended as self-recovery equipment to help free a bogged tank, but now serving as additional standoff protection against magnetic mines. Others had spare track links welded to vulnerable areas, adding more steel over thin armor. These modifications spread throughout the Pacific theater, not through official channels but through what modern military theorists might call horizontal innovation. Tank crews saw what worked for others and copied it. Maintenance battalions shared techniques. Even Army tank battalions, which had initially been skeptical of Marine improvisations, began adopting wooden armor after seeing its effectiveness. The Japanese, for their part, tried to adapt. Intelligence reports from later in 1944 indicated they were training soldiers to remove or destroy the wooden armor before placing magnetic mines. But this required getting even closer to the tank, staying exposed longer, and the survival rate for these attacks approached 0. Some Japanese forces began relying more on buried mines and anti-tank guns positioned in elaborate camouflaged positions, accepting that the suicide mine attacks had become too costly even by their standards. Yet the attacks never completely stopped. Throughout 1944 and into 1945, Japanese defenders on every contested island attempted close-quarters attacks on American armor. At Saipan in June 1944, during the largest tank battle of the Pacific Campaign, several Shermans took magnetic mine hits. Those with wooden armor survived, those without did not. At Peleliu in September, at Iwo Jima in February 1945, and at Okinawa in the spring of 1945, the pattern repeated. Red Sullivan's Colorado II survived the entire war, bearing the scars of 6 separate magnetic mine attacks and countless attempts by Japanese soldiers to board it. Each time, the wooden armor or the anti-boarding spikes did their job. Red himself was wounded twice, once by shrapnel that found a gap in the wooden armor, once by a sniper's bullet that ricocheted off his helmet, but he survived to bring his tank and most of his crew home. He never stopped finding it remarkable that his life had been saved by lumber. The evolution of Sherman tank modifications in the Pacific represented something unprecedented in modern warfare, a complete reversal of the usual military innovation process. Typically, new weapons and defensive measures originated in research laboratories were tested extensively, then distributed through official channels with proper manuals and specifications. The wooden armor of the Pacific followed the opposite path. Born of battlefield necessity, refined through trial and error, spread through unofficial networks, and only later recognized and documented by higher command. By mid-1944, the phenomenon had grown so widespread that the Marine Corps Equipment Board finally conducted formal studies on these field modifications. Their report, classified at the time but declassified decades later, makes for fascinating reading. The engineers noted with barely concealed amazement that untrained marine tankers had independently discovered principles of spaced armor that had taken European designers years to develop. The board calculated that wooden planks with a 4-inch standoff provided protection equivalent to an additional 2 inches of steel armor against shaped charge weapons, but at a fraction of the weight and with zero impact on tank production schedules. The report also documented the incredible variety of improvised defenses Marines had developed. Beyond the standard wooden planks, crews had experimented with metal sheeting, corrugated iron panels, spare track sections, and even salvaged Japanese armor plates from destroyed enemy tanks. One creative crew on Guam had attached sections of Japanese concrete fortifications to their Sherman's sides, creating what amounted to reactive armor decades before the concept became standard. But the most extreme and most controversial modification involved concrete. The idea originated with Army tankers in the Philippines in late 1944. If wooden planks provided good protection, the thinking went, wouldn't concrete provide even better protection? Some crews began pouring concrete between the wooden framework and the steel hull, creating a composite armor sandwich. The concrete added substantial weight, often more than a ton, but in theory provided protection not just against shaped charges, but also against the Japanese 47mm anti-tank guns that occasionally appeared on the battlefield. The results were mixed at best. Yes, the concrete stopped shaped charges very effectively, but the extra weight stressed the Sherman's suspension, caused transmission failures, and made the tanks slower and more prone to bogging down in soft ground. Worse, when a tank with concrete armor took a direct hit from a large caliber gun, the concrete would often crack and spall, sending fragments of stone and rebar ricocheting around inside the crew compartment, essentially turning the armor into an additional weapon against the crew. Red Sullivan saw a concrete armored Sherman during the Philippines campaign in January 1945. The tank, nicknamed Fortress, belonged to the 754th Tank Battalion and had roughly 4 inches of concrete poured over its entire hull and turret. It looked like a rolling bunker, massively intimidating, practically invincible. It threw a track on its second day of combat, unable to handle the extra weight over rough terrain. While the crew worked to repair it, a Japanese 47mm anti-tank gun scored a direct hit on the turret. The concrete absorbed most of the impact, but the interior spalling killed the loader and wounded 2 others. Fortress was towed back to the rear and eventually had all the concrete chipped off, the tank returning to standard wooden armor. The lesson was clear. More protection wasn't always better protection. The wooden armor had succeeded precisely because it was simple, lightweight, and didn't compromise the tank's mobility or mechanical reliability. Concrete represented the same kind of thinking that had led to the massive, immobile, super-heavy tanks that Germany was building, impressive on paper, but impractical in reality. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Battle for Iwo Jima, beginning February 19, 1945, represented both the apex and the vindication of improvised armor modifications. The 5th Marine Amphibious Corps brought ashore 3 tank battalions, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Tank Battalions, mustering approximately 150 Sherman tanks, making it the largest tank force ever assembled by the Marine Corps in a single operation. Every single one of these tanks carried improvised armor of some kind. The Japanese defenders under Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had prepared extensively, constructing an elaborate network of tunnels, bunkers, and fighting positions in the volcanic rock. Kuribayashi, one of Japan's most capable commanders, had studied American tactics carefully. He knew that suicide banzai charges accomplished nothing except getting his men killed. Instead, he planned a defense in depth, using every cave and ravine to maximum advantage, forcing the Americans to pay in blood for every yard of ground. Kuribayashi also understood that American tanks were the key to Marine Corps offensive power. His men had standing orders to target tanks whenever possible, using every weapon available: anti-tank guns, buried mines, artillery, and yes, still the occasional suicide attack with magnetic mines or satchel charges. The volcanic ash and rocky terrain of Iwo Jima proved nightmarish for armor. Tanks bogged down in the soft black sand near the beaches, threw tracks on the sharp volcanic rock inland, and presented easy targets on the bare slopes. Japanese anti-tank guns, dug into caves with only their barrels visible, could fire several rounds before American forces could identify and suppress them. Sergeant Frank McCarthy, a tank commander with the 4th Marine Tank Battalion, later described the experience. You'd be grinding along, and suddenly there'd be a clang and a flash, and you'd realize someone just shot at you from a cave you couldn't even see. Then maybe 20 Japs would come boiling out of the ground with mines and satchel charges, and you'd be backing up and firing every gun you had, and the infantry would be shooting, and it was just chaos. The only thing that kept us alive was that wooden armor and those spikes all over the tank. I saw Japs try to climb onto my tank at least 4 times on Iwo. Every time, they either couldn't get a grip or they impaled themselves on the spikes. The Japanese attempted several nighttime counterattacks during the battle, including one on the night of March 8th, where approximately 800 Japanese troops infiltrated American lines. Several groups specifically targeted tank parks, hoping to destroy the Shermans while their crews slept nearby. They partially succeeded. Several tanks were damaged or destroyed by satchel charges placed in engine compartments. But significantly more attacks failed when Japanese soldiers couldn't get past the anti-boarding defenses or when magnetic mines detonated uselessly against wooden armor. By the time Iwo Jima was declared secure on March 26th, the Marine Corps had lost dozens of tanks, but analysis showed that only 3 had been knocked out by magnetic mines, compared to 14 at Tarawa, where wooden armor had been limited. The improvised defenses had proven their worth under the most extreme combat conditions. The last major campaign of the Pacific War, the Battle for Okinawa beginning April 1, 1945, saw improvised armor reach its final evolution. By this point, both Marine and Army tank battalions had standardized the modifications. Wooden planks weren't just tolerated, they were expected. Supply lines now included lumber specifically designated for tank armor. Engineering manuals, hastily produced, provided specifications for proper installation. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Here was the United States, the world's greatest industrial power, shipping oak planks across the Pacific so tankers could manually bolt them to 33-ton war machines that represented the pinnacle of mechanical engineering. It was like equipping fighter pilots with slingshots, except it actually worked. Okinawa presented unique challenges. The island was large enough for genuine armored warfare, with open ground that allowed tanks to maneuver in coordination. But it was also heavily fortified, with Japanese defenders who had learned from every previous campaign. They knew about the wooden armor, they'd adapted their tactics. Intelligence reports captured during the campaign revealed Japanese training manuals specifically addressing American tank modifications. One document, translated by Marine intelligence officers, instructed soldiers to first remove the wooden outer layer with fire or explosives, then apply magnetic mines to the exposed steel underneath. Another suggested using larger satchel charges up to 20 pounds of explosives that could destroy wooden armor and penetrate the hull in a single blast. But these adaptations required time and positioning that Japanese soldiers rarely had. American tanks didn't operate alone, they moved with infantry support, with artillery on call, often with air support overhead. Getting close enough to a Sherman to methodically remove its wooden armor and then place a mine was essentially suicide with no guarantee of success. Corporal Thomas Reeves, a tank driver with the 193rd Tank Battalion on Okinawa, experienced the ultimate test of improvised armor on May 4th during a massive Japanese counterattack. His tank, Desert Rat, a veteran of North Africa that had been shipped to the Pacific and modified with full wooden armor, was supporting infantry near the town of Maeda when Japanese forces launched a coordinated assault. They came at us from 3 directions, Reeves later recounted in an interview. Infantry, knee mortars, everything they had. I counted 6 separate attempts to get mines on us. Every single one failed because of those planks. One Jap actually made it onto the engine deck, but he couldn't get the hatch open because of the spikes we'd welded there, and our tank commander shot him. Without those modifications, we'd have been dead 10 times over. Desert Rat survived the battle, though its wooden armor was completely destroyed and had to be replaced. The tank itself was undamaged. The crew requested and received permission to write the number 6 on the new wooden planks, one for each magnetic mine that had been defeated. As May turned to June and the Okinawa campaign ground toward its bloody conclusion, the full scale of the improvised armor program's success became clear. Army and Marine Corps after-action reports documented that tanks with full wooden armor suffered approximately 70% fewer losses to close-quarters attacks than tanks without such modifications. The difference was stark enough that some units refused to commit unmodified tanks to combat, considering it tantamount to sending the crews on a suicide mission. Yet, despite this overwhelming evidence, getting official recognition and standardization remained frustratingly difficult. The Ordnance Department, responsible for tank design and production, viewed the wooden armor as an embarrassing admission that their vehicles had a critical flaw. Various proposals circulated for factory-installed protective systems, metal skirts, built-in spaced armor, even electromagnetic systems that would somehow neutralize magnetic mines. All required extensive research, testing, and retooling of production facilities. Meanwhile, Marine and Army tank crews kept bolting on lumber. The Japanese surrender in August 1945 ended the Pacific War before any official solution could be implemented. In the aftermath, as American forces occupied Japan and began the long process of demobilization, thousands of Sherman tanks sat in depots across the Pacific, still wearing their improvised wooden armor. Some were stripped down and refurbished for shipment home. Others were simply abandoned, left to rust in the tropical climate, their wooden planks rotting away. Red Sullivan returned to Colorado in October 1945, having survived the entire war from Tarawa to Okinawa. He'd been in 6 major campaigns, commanded 3 different tanks, all named Colorado, and been recommended for the Bronze Star for actions on Iwo Jima. He'd seen friends die in burning tanks, had pulled wounded men from wrecked vehicles, had fired thousands of rounds from the 75mm main gun, and probably tens of thousands from the machine guns. When asked years later what single factor most contributed to his survival, he didn't hesitate. The wooden armor. No question. I'd be dead without it, probably at Tarawa, or definitely in Saipan. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't sophisticated, but it worked. That's all that mattered. The official military histories of the Pacific War, written in the late 1940s and early 1950s, largely glossed over the improvised armor phenomenon. There were brief mentions in technical reports, a few paragraphs in unit histories, but nothing commensurate with its actual importance. Perhaps it seemed too mundane, too unsophisticated for a war that featured atomic bombs, radar, and jet aircraft. Or perhaps it was simply embarrassing, an admission that battlefield improvisation had succeeded where official engineering had failed. But tank crews remembered. Veterans organizations devoted entire sections of their newsletters to discussions of field modifications. Reunions featured debates about whether wooden planks or metal sheeting had been more effective, whether the anti-boarding spikes should have been longer, whether concrete had ever really been worth the weight penalty. These discussions, passionate and detailed, kept alive the memory of battlefield innovation. The military lessons of improvised armor eventually percolated through official channels, though it took years. Post-war tank designs incorporated spaced armor as a standard feature, with official specifications and testing. The M48 Patton tank of the 1950s had built-in standoff protection. The M60 that followed improved on it further. By the time the M1 Abrams entered service in the 1980s, its composite armor used principles that Marine tankers had stumbled upon empirically 4 decades earlier. Multiple layers with air gaps to defeat shaped charges. But none of these sophisticated systems matched the elegant simplicity of 2-inch oak planks bolted to steel channels. The deeper irony, the one that Red Sullivan and thousands of other veterans understood intuitively, was that the wooden armor represented something fundamentally American. It wasn't about having the best technology or the most advanced weapons. It was about practical problem-solving, about seeing what worked and doing it, regardless of whether it appeared in any manual or met any official specification. It was about trusting frontline soldiers to identify problems and find solutions. The Sherman tank itself embodied this philosophy. It wasn't the best tank of World War II by most technical measures. German Panthers and Tigers had thicker armor and more powerful guns. Soviet T-34 seconds were more heavily armored and better suited to rough terrain. But the Sherman was reliable, easy to maintain, and produced in staggering numbers, more than 49,000 built during the war. It could be repaired with basic tools by minimally trained crews. Parts were interchangeable and readily available. It worked. Adding wooden planks to it was perfectly consistent with this design philosophy, a simple, practical solution to a specific problem, implemented rapidly with available materials. The Japanese, for all their courage and determination, never developed equivalent improvisation. Their tanks remained fundamentally unchanged throughout the war, growing increasingly obsolete as American armor improved. Part of this reflected Japan's limited industrial capacity. They simply couldn't afford to constantly redesign and retool production. But it also reflected a more rigid military culture, one that valued conformity to plan over adaptation to circumstances. American tank crews, by contrast, treated their vehicles as works in progress, constantly modifying and improving them based on combat experience. The wooden armor was just the most visible and widespread of these modifications. Crews also altered vision blocks for better visibility, installed additional radios for improved communication, added extra machine guns for increased firepower, and made countless other small changes that collectively transformed the Sherman from a good tank into an excellent one. Lieutenant Colonel William Buse, who commanded the 4th Marine Tank Battalion on Iwo Jima, later wrote in his memoirs about the cultural difference. The Japanese soldier was incredibly brave, incredibly determined, but also incredibly inflexible. They had been told that magnetic mines would defeat American tanks, so they kept using magnetic mines even after it became clear our modifications had rendered them largely ineffective. They kept climbing onto our tanks even after we'd covered them with spikes. They followed their doctrine even when their doctrine was killing them. Our boys, on the other hand, saw a problem, came up with a solution, tried it, and if it worked, kept using it. That flexibility, that willingness to improvise, may have been our greatest advantage. By the time the United States entered the Korean War in June 1950, the wooden armor had passed into legend. The Shermans that fought in Korea, mostly M4A3E8 models with improved suspensions and 76mm guns, didn't carry wooden planks. They didn't need to. North Korean and Chinese forces didn't employ the same suicide anti-tank tactics that the Japanese had. Their doctrine was Soviet-influenced, emphasizing anti-tank guns and mines rather than individual close-quarters attacks. But the lessons of improvisation remained. When American troops in Korea discovered their tanks were vulnerable to North Korean T-34 seconds, they quickly improvised solutions. Better ammunition, improved tactics, coordination with air support. When winter cold caused mechanical failures, crews developed field modifications to keep engines running. The spirit of pragmatic innovation lived on. Red Sullivan lived to see the 50th anniversary of VJ Day in 1995. He attended a reunion of the 2nd Marine Tank Battalion, held that year in San Diego. Of the hundreds of men who'd served in the battalion during the war, fewer than 100 were still alive to attend. They were old men now, in their 70s and 80s, but when they gathered around a restored M4 Sherman borrowed from a museum and modified with period-accurate wooden armor for the occasion, decades fell away. They ran their hands over the oak planks, traced the steel channels, and examined the welded spikes on the hatches. Younger attendees, children and grandchildren of the veterans, asked questions. How much did the wood weigh? Did it really stop the mines? Weren't you scared? Red answered patiently, as did the other veterans. Yes, it stopped the mines. No, we weren't really scared. Well, we were, but you couldn't think about it. You just did your job. And yes, it seemed crazy at the time, protecting a modern tank with lumber. But it worked. That's what mattered. It worked. One of the younger attendees, a Marine lieutenant who commanded a tank platoon equipped with M1A1 Abrams, examined the wooden armor with professional interest. Sir, he asked Red, knowing what you know now, having survived the war with these modifications, do you think the wooden armor was the most important innovation of the Pacific Tank War? Red considered the question carefully. He'd had 70 years to think about it, after all. Most important? I don't know about that. But it might have been the most American. We had a problem. The Japs had figured out how to kill our tanks. We couldn't wait for Detroit to design a solution, couldn't wait for the Ordnance Department to run tests and issue specifications. So we solved it ourselves, with whatever was on hand. Wood from supply crates, nails from engineering stores, ingenuity and necessity. That's pretty American, when you think about it. He paused, then added, and yeah, it saved my life. Probably saved hundreds, maybe thousands of lives. So was it important? You bet it was. The sun was setting over San Diego Bay as the reunion wound down. The restored Sherman sat in the parking lot, its wooden armor golden in the late afternoon light. Veterans posed for photos, shook hands, and promised to stay in touch. Some would make it to the 60th anniversary reunion. Some wouldn't. Time, the one enemy that no armor can defeat, was taking its toll. But the story lived on. In museums across the country, restored Sherman tanks displayed wooden armor modifications, often with plaques explaining their origin and purpose. In military history books, the improvised armor of the Pacific earned its own chapters. Film documentaries featured interviews with veterans like Red Sullivan, their first-hand accounts preserving the memory of battlefield innovation. And in military academies, officers studied the wooden armor phenomenon as a case study in adaptive leadership and bottom-up innovation. The lesson, taught to each new generation of military leaders, was simple but profound. Sometimes the best solution isn't the most sophisticated one. Sometimes practical improvisation beats elaborate engineering. And sometimes you win wars not by having the best equipment, but by having soldiers smart enough and flexible enough to make their equipment work. The wooden armor of the Pacific represented a moment when the industrial might of America, its factories, its engineering prowess, its technological sophistication, took second place to simpler virtues: ingenuity, practicality, the willingness to try something new. It was a reminder that wars are won not just by machines, but by the men who operate them. And it proved, beyond any doubt, that in the chaos and brutality of combat, the simplest solutions are often the best ones. When Red Sullivan died in 2003 at the age of 82, his funeral was attended by dozens of fellow veterans, their numbers dwindling with each passing year. The Marine Corps sent an honor guard, a Sherman tank from a local museum, wooden armor, and all was displayed outside the church. Taps were played, a flag was folded and presented to his daughter. In his eulogy, Red's son spoke about his father's reluctance to discuss the war, how for decades he'd kept his experiences largely private, shared only with fellow veterans who understood. But in his final years, Red had opened up, recognizing the importance of passing these stories to a new generation. He'd done interviews, spoken at schools, written down his memories. "My father always said the wooden armor saved his life," Red's son told the assembled mourners. But I think it represented something more to him. It represented the idea that Americans don't give up when faced with a problem. We don't wait for someone else to fix things. We figure it out ourselves. We improvise, we adapt, we overcame it. That's what those wooden planks meant to him. Not just protection for a tank, but proof that American ingenuity and determination could solve any problem, no matter how daunting. The Sherman tank sitting outside, its wooden armor weathered but still solid after all these years, stood as a silent testament to that truth. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.